February 6th, 1945 dawned cold and gray over the volcanic island of Iwo Jima, where nearly 22,000 Japanese soldiers waited in an elaborate network of tunnels and caves, preparing to fight to the last man. The American command knew this 8-square-mile piece of ash and sulfur would exact a terrible price, yet they had no choice. The island's airfields were essential for the final assault on Japan itself. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commanding the Japanese garrison, had spent months transforming Iwo Jima into a fortress, unlike any the Americans had encountered. He abandoned the traditional Japanese strategy of meeting invaders at the beach with suicidal banzai charges. Instead, he ordered his men deep underground, creating 11 miles of tunnels connecting 1,500 defensive positions. The volcanic rock, though difficult to excavate, provided natural protection against naval bombardment. Every cave housed artillery pieces and machine guns positioned to create overlapping fields of fire across the beaches. The preliminary bombardment began on February 13th, 3 days before the invasion. For 72 hours, American warships pounded the island with shells, while carrier aircraft dropped bombs and napalm. The volcanic slopes erupted in fire and smoke, yet beneath the surface, Kuribayashi's men waited in their tunnels, largely unscathed. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner watched from his flagship, believing the bombardment had neutralized the defenses. He could not have been more wrong. At 9 o'clock on the morning of February 19th, the first wave of Marines from the 4th and 5th Divisions hit the beaches. The black volcanic sand, formed from centuries of eruptions, made movement agonizingly slow. Men sank to their ankles with each step, unable to run or find cover. The tracked vehicles bogged down immediately, creating obstacles for those behind. For the first moments, an eerie silence hung over the landing force. No enemy fire greeted them. Then Kuribayashi sprang his trap. Hidden artillery pieces and mortars opened fire simultaneously, turning the beaches into a killing ground. Machine gun nests carved into Mount Suribachi's slopes raked the Marines with interlocking fire. Men fell by the dozens, then by the hundreds. The volcanic sand, black moments before, turned dark red. Medics struggled to reach the wounded, only to become casualties themselves. The carefully planned landing schedule collapsed into chaos as follow-on waves piled into the carnage. By nightfall, 30,000 Marines had landed at a cost of over 2,000 casualties. They held a precarious beachhead, barely 600 yards deep. The Japanese counterattacked throughout the night, small infiltration teams emerging from hidden tunnels to create havoc in American lines. Dawn revealed the true horror: bodies and equipment scattered across the black sand, wrecked landing craft bobbing in the surf, and the realization that this battle would be unlike any other. According to combat reports preserved in the National Archives, the first day's casualties exceeded those of the entire Tarawa campaign. Major General Harry Schmidt, commanding the landing force, sent a grim message to Admiral Turner. Progress slow against heavy resistance. Enemy positions mutually supporting and extremely difficult to reduce. This will be a long and costly operation. The bloody road to Japan's surrender had truly begun. February 23, 1945 became immortalized in American military history, though few who witnessed the moment understood its immediate significance. 4 days of brutal fighting had brought elements of the 28th Marine Regiment to the base of Mount Suribachi, the 546-foot volcanic cone dominating Iwo Jima's southern tip. Every yard gained cost blood as Japanese defenders emerged from caves to fire point-blank into advancing Marines before retreating into the tunnels. Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson ordered a 40-man patrol from Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, to scale Suribachi's slopes and secure the summit. Led by 1st Lieutenant Harold Schreer, the Marines began their ascent at 8 o'clock in the morning, expecting fierce resistance. Instead, they encountered only sporadic rifle fire. The Japanese garrison within the mountain, cut off from resupply and decimated by days of flamethrower and demolition attacks, had largely been destroyed. At 10:20, the patrol reached the crater rim. Schreier's men found a length of pipe amid the debris, attached a small American flag brought from their transport ship, and raised it over the mountain. Below on the beaches and offshore, men cheered and ships sounded their horns. Yet this first flag raising, witnessed by fewer than 100 men, would be overshadowed by events 2 hours later. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, visiting the island with General Holland Smith, saw the flag and declared he wanted it as a souvenir. Johnson, furious that a symbol purchased with Marine blood might become a politician's trophy, sent a runner with a larger replacement flag borrowed from a nearby LST. Photographer Joe Rosenthal of the Associated Press, arriving on the summit just as the second flag raising began, captured 6 men struggling against the wind to plant the pole, an image that would become the most reproduced photograph in history. But the flag flying over Suribachi brought no respite to the carnage below. The battle's deadliest phase was just beginning. The Marines faced a nightmare landscape of broken rock, concrete pillboxes, and thousands of hidden entrances to Kuribayashi's tunnel system. Traditional infantry tactics proved useless. Tanks and artillery couldn't touch positions buried under 30 feet of rock. Only close combat could reduce the defenses. Flamethrowers, demolition charges, and point-blank gunfire, cave by cave, tunnel by tunnel. The Japanese fought with a ferocity born of desperation and honor. Small teams would emerge from tunnels behind American lines, attack supply dumps or command posts, then disappear underground. Wounded Japanese soldiers detonated grenades when American medics approached. Some tunnels held 50 men who refused surrender, fighting until flamethrower teams burned them out or demolition charges sealed them inside forever. Corporal Tony Stein of the 1st Battalion, 28th Marines, fashioned a makeshift machine gun from a wrecked aircraft and used it to cover his squad's advance across 800 yards of open ground. He made 8 trips back to the beach to resupply ammunition, returning each time to the front. On his last trip, Stein carried 3 wounded men to safety before Japanese fire killed him yards from the aid station. He received the Medal of Honor posthumously, one of 27 awarded for actions on Iwo Jima, more than any other single battle in American history. As February ended, the Americans controlled roughly half the island. The cost: 7,000 Marines killed or wounded. Japanese losses approached 10,000, yet Kuribayashi's remaining forces showed no sign of breaking. Intelligence estimated 2 more weeks of fighting. The actual timeline would prove far bloodier. March 1st, 1945 marked the beginning of the most grueling phase of the Iwo Jima campaign, as American forces pushed into the island's northern highlands where General Kuribayashi had concentrated his most elaborate defenses. The terrain itself seemed designed for slaughter: rocky ridges, honeycomb with caves, deep ravines perfect for ambush, and broken ground where every boulder might conceal a Japanese soldier waiting with a magnetic mine or satchel charge. The 3 American divisions, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marines, advanced on a front barely 1,000 yards wide, compressed into a killing zone where Japanese artillery and mortars could range every square foot. Casualties mounted with horrifying speed. Companies went into battle with 200 men and emerged hours later with fewer than 100 still standing. Replacement troops, some fresh from training and barely 19 years old, found themselves in combat within hours of landing, thrust into a maelstrom of violence that shattered peacetime conceptions of warfare. Kuribayashi's defensive system in the north represented engineering genius wedded to military necessity. His troops had carved positions directly into solid rock, creating bunkers that could withstand direct hits from battleship shells. Tunnels connected defensive positions, allowing troops to retreat from one position, move underground, and emerge to attack American flanks or rear areas. Artillery pieces mounted on rails could be fired from cave mouths, then withdrawn before American counter-battery fire arrived. The Japanese commander had studied American tactics extensively during his pre-war assignment as a military attaché in the United States, and he used this knowledge to devastating effect. The Marines developed new tactics born of desperation. Flamethrower teams became the most crucial and most endangered specialists on the battlefield. A Marine carrying 70 pounds of jellied gasoline on his back presented an obvious target, and Japanese snipers targeted flamethrower operators mercilessly. Yet only flame could clear the caves and bunkers. Teams would approach a position, pour fire into the entrance until the occupants died or fled. Then demolition experts would seal the position with high explosives to prevent reoccupation. This process repeated hundreds of times daily, measured in yards gained and lives spent. Correspondent Robert Sherrod, embedded with the 5th Division, filed a dispatch to Time magazine describing the battle's nature. "The fighting is the bitterest, the casualties the highest, the gains the smallest of any American battle in this war. Men advance against positions they cannot see, held by enemies who will not surrender across ground that provides no cover. They die within yards of safety, cut down by fire from caves they have already passed." The Japanese defenders faced equally horrific conditions. Cut off from resupply, they subsisted on reduced rations, often just a handful of rice daily. Water became scarce as American forces captured the island's few natural sources. The constant bombardment from artillery, aircraft, and naval guns made surface movement suicidal, confining the garrison to their underground positions. Yet discipline held, and most fought on with the same determination they had shown on February 19th. By March 10th, American casualties exceeded 20,000, including nearly 4,000 dead. 3 Marine divisions, each theoretically capable of independent operations, were fought down to bare combat effectiveness. General Schmidt requested and received additional reinforcements, a rare acknowledgement that the pre-invasion intelligence had dramatically underestimated Japanese strength and determination. The northern end of the island, comprising less than 1 square mile, still held 8,000 Japanese defenders who showed no intention of surrender. The bloodiest fighting still lay ahead. March 16, 1945 brought a grim milestone, as American casualties on Iwo Jima exceeded Japanese casualties for the first time in the Pacific War, a stark testament to the cost of dislodging defenders who had literally gone underground. General Kuribayashi, now commanding from a cave complex near Kitano Point on the island's northern tip, understood his situation was hopeless. Yet he remained committed to extracting maximum American blood for every foot of volcanic rock. The battle had evolved into a medieval siege transported to the 20th century. American engineers used bulldozers to seal cave entrances, entombing Japanese defenders alive. When that failed, they pumped gasoline into tunnel systems and ignited it, creating underground infernos. The Japanese responded by flooding tunnels with sulfur fumes from natural vents, creating gas-filled death traps for Marines who penetrated their defenses. War had been stripped to its most primitive and brutal essence. Intelligence reports indicated Kuribayashi commanded approximately 3,000 effective troops, concentrated in the island's northwest corner around a complex of ravines the Marines grimly dubbed Death Valley and Turkey Knob. These positions, built into terrain so broken that tanks could barely maneuver, represented the Japanese commander's final stand. He had already radioed Tokyo that he expected no relief and would fight until annihilated, requesting only that the emperor remember his men's sacrifice. The Americans brought overwhelming firepower to bear. Battleships moved close inshore, firing directly into cave mouths at point-blank range. Artillery batteries, now positioned across the southern 2/3 of the island, maintained constant bombardment. Yet the Japanese positions carved deep into solid rock largely survived. The only solution remained the same as it had been since February 19th. Marine infantry would have to go in and dig them out at close quarters. Private First Class Douglas Jacobson of the 3rd Battalion, 23rd Marines, exemplified the desperate courage required in those final days. On February 26th, after his squad leader was killed, Jacobson grabbed a bazooka and single-handedly destroyed 16 Japanese positions over 4 hours of continuous fighting. He knocked out machine gun nests, pillboxes, and a tank, expending his entire ammunition load multiple times and returning to American lines to resupply before advancing again. His actions cleared a path for his battalion's advance, and he survived the battle to receive the Medal of Honor. March 25th marked the official end of organized resistance, as American commanders declared the island secure. Yet the declaration meant little to Marines still dying as they cleared caves and bunkers. That night, Kuribayashi led a final 300-man assault on American positions near the airfield, a desperate charge reminiscent of traditional Japanese tactics he had previously avoided. The attack penetrated American lines, overran command posts and created chaos before Marine reinforcements contained and destroyed the attackers. Kuribayashi died in the fighting, his body never definitively identified among the hundreds of Japanese corpses. Historical records from the Marine Corps History Division note that organized resistance ended on March 26, 36 days after the initial landing. The American casualty count reached 26,000, including nearly 7,000 killed. Of the 22,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 surrendered. The rest died fighting or committed suicide. Iwo Jima represented the highest casualty rate relative to forces engaged of any battle in American military history, a record that stands to this day. Yet even as the last shots echoed across Iwo Jima's devastated landscape, American bombers were already using its airfields to escort raids on Japan's home islands. The strategic necessity that had demanded the island's capture was being fulfilled, though the cost exceeded anything military planners had envisioned. More importantly, Iwo Jima provided a terrifying preview of what an invasion of Japan itself might entail. March 9, 1945 brought a new horror to the Pacific War, one that would ultimately prove more consequential than even the battles raging on Iwo Jima. At 10:15 in the evening, Major General Curtis LeMay's 334 B-29 Superfortress bombers lifted off from bases in the Mariana Islands, bound for Tokyo on a mission that would redefine strategic bombing and foreshadow the war's apocalyptic conclusion. LeMay had made a radical tactical decision that appalled many of his subordinates. He ordered the bombers to attack from low altitude at night, stripped of most defensive armament to maximize incendiary bomb loads. The general's reasoning was brutally pragmatic. High-altitude precision bombing had proven ineffective against Japan's dispersed industrial targets. But Tokyo's dense residential districts, built primarily of wood and paper, would burn readily if attacked with enough incendiaries. The human cost of such an attack troubled LeMay, but he believed shortening the war justified any means. The lead Pathfinder aircraft reached Tokyo shortly after midnight on March 10th, dropping magnesium marker flares over the Shitamachi district, the city's most densely populated area. Within minutes, the main bomber stream arrived and began dropping M69 incendiary cluster bombs. Each cluster released 38 individual bomblets that scattered jellied gasoline across a wide area. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Hundreds of fires erupted simultaneously across 16 square miles of urban landscape, and within 30 minutes these individual fires merged into a single firestorm. The phenomenon of a firestorm, previously experienced at Hamburg and Dresden in Europe, occurs when numerous fires create their own weather system. Superheated air rises rapidly, creating winds at ground level that can exceed 100 miles per hour. These winds feed oxygen to the flames while pulling in everything combustible. The temperature at ground level exceeded 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to boil water instantly and ignite human beings without direct flame contact. Approximately 1 million Tokyo residents lived in the targeted area, and most were asleep when the attack began. The Japanese civil defense system, designed around firefighting, collapsed immediately as the sheer number of simultaneous fires overwhelmed available resources. Residents fled toward the Sumida River and Sensoji Temple's grounds, hoping water and open space would provide refuge. Instead, they found these areas already packed with thousands of earlier arrivals. As the firestorm intensified, many who reached the river jumped in to escape the heat, only to discover the water itself was nearly boiling. Others suffocated as the firestorm consumed available oxygen. According to declassified strategic bombing survey documents, compiled after the war, approximately 100,000 civilians died that night, more than would die in either of the atomic bombings 5 months later. The fire destroyed over 267,000 buildings and left more than 1 million people homeless. 16 square miles of Tokyo simply ceased to exist, reduced to ash and twisted metal. The attack succeeded beyond LeMay's expectations and established the template for what would follow. Captain Robert Morgan, piloting the B-29 Dauntless Dottie, later described the scene. The fire was so bright you could read a newspaper in the cockpit at 5,000 feet. The smell of burning flesh reached us even at altitude. We flew through updrafts from the firestorm so violent they threw the aircraft around like a toy. Below us, Tokyo was dying. The attack's success convinced LeMay that strategic bombing could break Japan's will to resist without an invasion. Over the following weeks, his bombers struck Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and dozens of other Japanese cities with similar incendiary attacks. By June, American bombers had destroyed more than 170 square miles of Japan's urban area and killed an estimated 300,000 civilians. The Japanese government, however, showed no sign of surrendering. Instead, military leaders intensified preparations for the final defense of the home islands, promising to turn all Japan into another Iwo Jima. April 1, 1945, Easter Sunday, saw the largest amphibious operation in the Pacific War commence as 182,000 American troops stormed ashore on Okinawa, a 60-mile-long island just 350 miles from mainland Japan. The landing met virtually no resistance, a deceptive calm that led Marines to joke they were on Easter egg hunt rather than an invasion. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, commanding 100,000 Japanese defenders, had studied Iwo Jima's lessons and concluded that contesting beaches was suicide. Instead, he positioned his forces in the island's rugged southern highlands, where ancient castles and tomb complexes had been converted into fortified positions capable of sustaining months of siege. The American advance proceeded rapidly for the first week, securing the island's northern two-thirds with light casualties. General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., commanding the 10th Army, believed victory would come quickly. Then his forces encountered the Shuri Line, a defensive system centered on the medieval Shuri Castle and extending across the island's width. The advance stopped as if hitting a brick wall, and Okinawa transformed into a brutal war of attrition, reminiscent of World War I's Western Front. The Japanese defense employed tactics perfected on Iwo Jima, but adapted to Okinawa's terrain. Rather than holding fixed positions until destroyed, defenders would resist fiercely, then retreat through underground tunnels to secondary positions, forcing the Americans to take the same ground multiple times. Artillery and mortars positioned in caves throughout the highlands maintained constant fire on American positions. Japanese commanders understood they couldn't win but intended to inflict such horrific casualties that America might accept a negotiated peace rather than invade the home islands. Heavy spring rains turned the battlefield into a quagmire. Vehicles bogged down in mud, sometimes exceeding 3 feet deep. Supply trucks couldn't reach frontline units, forcing combat troops to carry ammunition and supplies forward by hand through knee-deep muck while under constant artillery fire. The mud also prevented evacuation of wounded, who lay for hours or days in flooded foxholes before medical teams could reach them. Disease spread rapidly. Cases of combat fatigue, dysentery, and immersion foot multiplied faster than battle casualties in some units. The Japanese unleashed their most desperate weapon on April 6th, Operation Kikusui, or Floating Chrysanthemum, the first of 10 massive kamikaze attacks that would continue through June. 355 suicide aircraft, including conventional planes and Oka rocket-powered flying bombs piloted by volunteers on one-way missions, descended on the American fleet supporting the invasion. Destroyers on radar picket duty bore the brunt, with 14 ships sunk and dozens damaged in a single day. Sailors watched in horror as damaged aircraft, pilots already dead at the controls, continued toward their targets through sheer momentum. The kamikaze campaign ultimately sent over 1,900 suicide aircraft against the American fleet, sinking 36 ships and damaging more than 360 others. Nearly 5,000 American sailors died, and another 5,000 were wounded, casualties exceeding total losses for the entire Pearl Harbor attack. The psychological impact proved equally devastating. Conventional air attack offered the possibility of defense, but kamikazes required destruction. Any hit might mean only wounded aircraft and pilot continued toward their target, immune to pain or fear. On land, the battle for the Shuri Line dragged through April and into May with agonizing slowness. American forces, employing artillery on a scale unprecedented in the Pacific, fired shells until gun barrels wore out and had to be replaced. Tank battalions fought at close quarters, exchanging fire with Japanese anti-tank guns at ranges measured in yards. Flamethrower teams, as on Iwo Jima, became the decisive weapons, but casualties among these specialists exceeded 50% in many units. Ernie Pyle, America's most beloved war correspondent who had covered the European campaign from North Africa to France, arrived on Okinawa in April to report on the Pacific War. On April 18th, while accompanying Marines on patrol, he died instantly when a Japanese machine gun burst struck him in the head. His death shocked the American public and emphasized that even in the war's final months, death showed no favoritism. Every day on Okinawa brought fresh casualties among famous and anonymous alike. June 21, 1945 marked the official end of organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa, 82 days after the landing. American casualties totaled over 49,000, including more than 12,000 killed, the highest toll of any Pacific campaign. Japanese losses exceeded 110,000 military personnel dead, and perhaps 150,000 Okinawan civilians killed, many forced into combat by Japanese forces or trapped in the crossfire. The island's pre-war population of 300,000 had been reduced by nearly half, and much of Okinawa resembled a lunar landscape of overlapping shell craters, destroyed villages, and improvised graves. General Buckner did not live to see the victory. On June 18, observing an attack by the 8th Marines on one of the final Japanese positions, he was struck and killed by shrapnel from a Japanese artillery shell, the highest-ranking American officer killed by enemy fire during World War II. His death, coming days before the battle's end, symbolized Okinawa's horrific cost and raised questions about whether the island's strategic value justified such carnage. Yet military planners considered Okinawa essential for Operation Downfall, the proposed invasion of Japan's home islands. The island would serve as a staging area for the greatest amphibious operation in history. Operation Olympic would land 14 combat divisions on Kyushu in November 1945, followed by Operation Coronet in spring 1946, landing another 14 divisions near Tokyo. Combined, these operations would employ more than 3 million American servicemen, and planners anticipated casualties that made Okinawa seem modest by comparison. Secretary of War Henry Stimson received the invasion casualty estimates in early June and found them almost incomprehensible. Staff officers projected American casualties of 400,000 to 800,000 for Olympic alone, with Japanese military and civilian casualties potentially exceeding 10 million. These figures assumed Japanese civilians would fight alongside military forces, as they had on Okinawa, where Ushijima had conscripted thousands of Okinawans, including high school students and elderly men, into the defense. Intelligence reports indicated the Japanese government had organized the entire home island population for Ketsugo, the decisive battle, with civilians training to attack American troops using bamboo spears, agricultural tools, and explosives. President Harry Truman, in office only since Franklin Roosevelt's death on April 12, faced an impossible decision. The American public wanted the war ended quickly. Families who had sent sons to fight in Europe now faced those same sons being transferred to the Pacific for the invasion. Yet the Japanese government, despite suffering complete military defeat, continued to resist surrender demands. Military hardliners in Tokyo argued that the American losses from invading Japan would force a negotiated peace that might preserve the emperor system and avoid occupation. They pointed to Iwo Jima and Okinawa as proof that American casualties could reach politically unsustainable levels. The situation grew more complex with Soviet intentions. Joseph Stalin had promised at the Yalta Conference in February to declare war on Japan 3 months after Germany's surrender, meaning Soviet entry into the Pacific War would come in early August. While Soviet participation might hasten Japan's surrender, it would also give the USSR territorial claims in Asia and influence in Japan's post-war government, outcomes Truman wished to avoid if possible. Meanwhile, in the New Mexico desert, scientists working on the Manhattan Project under J. Robert Oppenheimer approached completion of humanity's most destructive weapon. The atomic bomb, developed at enormous cost and shrouded in absolute secrecy, offered a potential alternative to invasion. A demonstration of the weapon's power might convince Japan's government that further resistance was futile. Yet even this possibility came with profound moral and strategic questions. Truman convened his senior military and civilian advisors to discuss options. General Douglas MacArthur insisted invasion remained necessary regardless of bombing campaigns. No amount of air attack could force Japan's surrender without occupying the home islands. Admiral William Leahy, Truman's chief of staff and the president's most trusted military advisor, argued that naval blockade combined with continued conventional bombing would eventually starve Japan into surrender without invasion or atomic weapons. General Henry Arnold, commanding the Army Air Forces, contended that conventional strategic bombing could destroy Japan's remaining industrial capacity and break civilian morale within months. Secretary Stimson advocated for using the atomic bomb if it proved operational, arguing that hundreds of thousands of American and millions of Japanese lives might be saved if the weapons demonstration convinced Tokyo to surrender. Yet he also recognized the unprecedented nature of such a weapon and its implications for humanity's future. His recommendation came with deep reservations about opening this particular Pandora's box. The decision ultimately fell to Truman alone, a former haberdasher from Missouri thrust into determining the fate of millions. July 16, 1945, at exactly 5:29 in the morning, the world changed forever in the New Mexico desert near Alamogordo. The Trinity test detonated with a force equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT, vaporizing the steel tower holding the device and turning desert sand into glass for hundreds of yards in all directions. The flash was visible 180 miles away, and the mushroom cloud rose over 7 miles into the stratosphere. Oppenheimer, watching from a bunker 6 miles distant, recalled a line from Hindu scripture. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Truman received word of Trinity's success while attending the Potsdam Conference near Berlin, where he met with Winston Churchill and Stalin to discuss post-war arrangements. The successful test transformed America's negotiating position. Suddenly, the United States possessed a weapon that might end the war without Soviet assistance. On July 26, America, Britain, and China issued the Potsdam Declaration, demanding Japan's unconditional surrender and warning of prompt and utter destruction if the demand was rejected. The declaration intentionally avoided mentioning the atomic bomb or guaranteeing the emperor's status, conditions that might have facilitated Japanese acceptance. Japan's government debated the declaration intensely. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo advocated acceptance, arguing that continued resistance meant national suicide. War Minister Korochika Anami and the military leadership demanded rejection, insisting Japan could still inflict unacceptable casualties on American invasion forces and force better surrender terms. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, attempting to balance these factions, made the fatal decision to mokusatsu the declaration, a Japanese term meaning both to ignore and to treat with silent contempt. International media interpreted this as defiant rejection. August 6, 1945 dawned clear over Hiroshima, a city of over 300,000 people that had largely escaped previous American bombing raids. At 8:15 in the morning, the B-29 Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, released a single atomic bomb nicknamed Little Boy from 31,000 feet. 43 seconds later, at an altitude of 1,900 feet above the city center, the weapon detonated with a force of approximately 15 kilotons. The explosion created a fireball with a temperature exceeding 1 million degrees Fahrenheit at its core. Everything within half a mile of ground zero was vaporized instantly. Buildings, trees, and human beings simply ceased to exist, their shadows sometimes permanently burned into concrete by the flash. The blast wave, traveling faster than sound, destroyed everything within a 1-mile radius, collapsing buildings and hurling debris at lethal velocities. Fires ignited across the city, merging into another firestorm similar to Tokyo's in March. Approximately 70,000 people died instantly, and another 70,000 would die from injuries and radiation exposure within months. Hiroshima had effectively been destroyed as a functioning city in less than 1 minute. Yet incredibly, The Japanese government's initial response was confusion rather than capitulation. Communications from Hiroshima were fragmentary, and military leaders in Tokyo initially dismissed reports as exaggerated or misunderstood. The true nature of what had occurred took days to comprehend fully. On August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria with over 1 million troops, crushing Japanese forces that had been steadily depleted to reinforce the home island's defense. Stalin, eager to claim territorial gains before Japan surrendered, launched the offensive on schedule regardless of the atomic bomb's implications. The simultaneous pressures of the atomic weapon and Soviet entry created a crisis that finally fractured the Japanese government's resistance. August 9th brought a second atomic bomb. Fat Man, a plutonium implosion weapon, was dropped on Kokura, the original target, but cloud cover forced the B-29 Boxcar to divert to its secondary target, Nagasaki. At 11:02 in the morning, the bomb detonated over Nagasaki's Urakami Valley with a yield of 21 kilotons. The city's irregular terrain channeled and deflected the blast, reducing the immediate casualties compared to Hiroshima, yet still killing approximately 40,000 instantly and another 25,000 in subsequent months. Emperor Hirohito finally intervened, an unprecedented action for a monarch who traditionally remained above political decisions. In an emergency cabinet meeting on August 10th, with the government deadlocked between surrender and continued resistance, Hirohito declared he could not bear to see his people suffer further. He accepted the Potsdam Declaration's terms, with the sole condition that his position as emperor be retained. The Allies agreed the emperor could remain as a constitutional monarch under Allied occupation authority. Even this decision nearly failed as military hardliners attempted a coup on August 14th, trying to seize the imperial palace and prevent broadcast of the emperor's surrender announcement. The coup collapsed when senior commanders refused to support it, but the attempt revealed how close Japan came to continuing the war even after 2 atomic bombings and Soviet invasion. August 15, 1945. At noon Tokyo time, Emperor Hirohito's recorded voice, never before heard by most Japanese citizens, announced surrender via radio broadcast. His language remained formal and indirect, speaking of enduring the unendurable and accepting a peace that preserved Japan's national polity. Throughout Japan, citizens wept, some from relief, others from shame at their nation's first-ever military defeat. September 2, 1945 saw formal surrender ceremonies aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. General Douglas MacArthur presided as Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu signed the instrument of surrender on behalf of Japan. Representatives from all Allied nations present added their signatures to the document that officially ended World War II. The war had cost approximately 15 million Asian lives, several million Japanese lives, and over 100,000 American lives in the Pacific Theater alone. Japan's cities lay in ruins, its industry destroyed, and its people facing an uncertain future under occupation. Yet the atomic bomb's use inaugurated an even more uncertain age, one in which humanity possessed the means to destroy itself entirely, a capability that would define international relations for generations to come. The bloody road to Japan's surrender had ended, but it left questions that continue to haunt history. Whether the atomic bombs were necessary to force surrender, whether alternatives might have achieved the same result with less carnage, and whether the precedent set in those final months of war made the world ultimately safer or more dangerous. These debates persist 8 decades later, suggesting that while the Pacific War ended in 1945, its moral and strategic implications may never fully resolve.